Did you know there is a university department in America that for the last 60 years has been entirely devoted to the singular purpose of evaluating whether or not the phenomena of reincarnation actually has any basis in reality? Their team of doctors and professors have studied over 2,500 unique cases of claimed reincarnation. In this video, I'll be covering their groundbreaking conclusions and explain their fascinating revelation about birthmarks and their relationship to the phenomena of claimed reincarnation. I say without any exaggeration that this may be the most important area of research going on in the world at the moment, which will have life-changing consequences for everyone who really understands the gravity of what has been discovered. This incredible story starts with the head of a psychiatry department at the University of Virginia. A highly credible medical doctor by the name of Ian Stevenson developed an interest in the phenomena of children claiming to have experienced past lives. Dr. Stevenson followed up on some of these claims, and upon doing so, realized that the phenomena was much more commonplace than he originally imagined. As his interest and research into the area grew, he requested to step down from his position as chair of the psychiatry department and establish his own department to study this phenomena after being donated $1 million by the recently deceased inventor of electrophotography. For those of us unsure what electrophotography is, that is the process by which most modern photocopying machines work. So this incredibly wealthy inventor was so convinced by Stevenson's early work that he left a significant portion of his wealth to aid in the research effort. With those funds under his belt, Stevenson was able to travel the world with his team and investigate thoroughly many thousands of these claimed reincarnation cases. Stevenson and his team have since traveled all continents and assessed cases from all cultures over a 60-year period, producing over 2,500 case reports that are indexed on 200 data points to assess their credibility and themes between all reincarnation cases studied. Dr. Stevenson unfortunately died in 2007, however his legacy and impressive body of work is still incredibly significant to this day. His department is now headed by famous child psychiatrist Dr. Jim Tucker, and they are continually building on the foundations he originally built. Before we begin reviewing the conclusions he and his department have made, it's incredibly important to understand how credible Stevenson was. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The phrase, made famous by Carl Sagan, applies heavily to this phenomena. What this department of very credible medical doctors, psychiatrists, and research professionals have produced over more than half a century of work requires the highest possible standard of scientific scrutiny, as the conclusion of their work has world-changing implications for absolutely everybody on planet Earth. Fortunately, there is an extraordinary amount of extraordinary evidence, and the scientists that have pioneered it all have a perfect reputation worthy of the subject matter. Described by the editor-in-chief of the Journal of the American Medical Association when reviewing one of Stevenson's books on reincarnation, the editor writes, "In regard to reincarnation, he has painstakingly and unemotionally collected a detailed series of cases from India, cases in which the evidence is difficult to explain on any other grounds. He has placed on record a large amount of data that cannot be ignored." An example of the type of 2,500 cases reviewed by Stevenson and his department, known as the Department of Perceptual Studies, covers the story of a child in America that at the age of 2 began having night terrors that involved graphic detail of a man dying in a fighter plane. This child would have night terrors over a period of 4 months, waking up in the middle of the night screaming and thrashing. In tears and in a semi-conscious state, the child would ramble things like "aeroplane crashed," "on fire," "little man, can't get out." When asked about the little man he kept referring to in these episodes, the child responded with the name James, the same name as himself, so the mother inquired further and got the name of a claimed friend of this other James the child was referring to, a man by the name of Jack LARSON, despite knowing nobody in his current life by that name, a case detail that will later be used to confirm his claims. It's important to remember before we proceed that this child is aged 2 when this phenomenon began being documented. As the child aged, he began to draw graphic images of plane combat and signed all of his drawings James No. 3. When asked about the number 3, he stated it was because he was the third James. At the same time these drawings began, so did the child's obsession with planes, and an encyclopedic level of knowledge about planes began to emerge that persisted into his early childhood. Slowly, James began divulging extra information about his past life in a nonchalant way, obviously not understanding that his behaviour was peculiar. His behaviour around planes and the way he would continually act out the death of the other James was indicative of trauma, despite no clear source of trauma in his current life. As James aged, his stories became more intelligible, and very specific details began to emerge, such as who shot his plane down. James claimed he was shot down by the Japanese, which his father, now curious about the child's bizarre behaviour, began to follow up on the details he was given, such as the name of the boat his plane flew from, specifically a boat named Natoma. This detail, along with the detail of his friend's claimed name, was so specific that the father was able to trace through extensive online and library research a US military boat that was engaged in the Battle of Iwo Jima that had a serviceman named Jack LARSON serving on board. Two pieces of information that alone would be an incredible coincidence that a toddler was able to recite such immensely specific information. However, following this nearly impossible coincidence, his father began to write down everything the child would recite, including bizarre things such as the recipe for napalm. With the child's father becoming increasingly involved in this case, he attended a reunion for this particular military boat Natoma, and there he discovered the name of the only man that died during that particular military operation, a man named James Houston Jr., the third James. Naturally, the parents then contacted the family of this James to see if further details the child recited matched things only his relatives would know, to further validate the child's claims. An interview can be found online of James Houston Jr.'s very elderly sister, where she states that she completely believes the young James is who he claims to be, as the details were far too specific, down to how the siblings would play as children nearly 70 years prior. Incredibly specific details like this are actually quite common in these cases, and while we cannot prove them, if the child is telling the truth, and if the relatives of these completely unrelated families are also telling the truth, then what it implies about reality changes everything. This particular case was so recent that it was covered in a documentary on Netflix named Surviving Death. If you are curious about this specific case, it's definitely worth a watch. This case, while extremely bizarre, has since been reviewed in depth by the Department of Perceptual Studies, and specifically the current head, Dr. Tucker. And it's important to know that this level of detail and follow-up is not uncommon, and is only one case within 2,500 that have been studied and critically assessed by the research team. When claims of reincarnation like this are made, the team follows a specific methodology that has evolved over time, but originally involved, and I'll quote from Stevenson directly, about how they verify these claims. My investigations of these cases included interviews, often repeated, with the subject and with several or many other informants from both families. With rare exceptions, only first-hand informants were interviewed. All pertinent written records that existed, particularly death certificates and post-mortem reports, were sought and examined. In the cases in which the informant said that the two families had no previous acquaintance, I made every effort to exclude all possibility that some information might nevertheless have passed normally to the child, perhaps through a half-forgotten mutual acquaintance of the two families. Now, investigators tend to involve picture recognition tests to assess the validity of the children's claims. They will find pictures from the child's claimed past life and then show them a similar control photo designed to trick them. Typically, the researchers find that the children pick the right photos at a level much higher than random chance. So when we stated before that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, these assessments and the sheer number of them make up the bulk of the evidence. However, the most compelling element of this phenomena is the correlation between birthmarks and birth defects with these reincarnation cases. This correlation has been so heavily documented that a 2,000-page, two-part book was written by Stevenson that documents this phenomena in extreme detail and makes up, in my opinion, the most convincing evidence that this phenomena truly is what it is claimed. For example, in these cases where birthmarks or birth defects are associated with the reincarnation story, often the child would claim a premature or unnatural death, whether that was by things like murder and war, or things like farming accidents. Either way, typically, the method of death in the past life seems to have made an impact on the body of the child claiming reincarnation. Things like stab wounds, burn marks, bullet holes have found their way of being marked on the reincarnated body, or the unexplained growth deformities on children's hands or feet that relate to a mortal injury on the body of the past life. Specifically, there are 18 cases where 2 birthmarks matched the entry and exit bullet wounds of gun-related deaths when checked against autopsy reports. Some interesting trends in the reincarnation data have emerged over the decades that indicate this phenomena has strong correlations with how the previous life ended, with the typical age of death of the previous life being around 28, and 25% of all cases involved, the past life died under the age of 15. Over 70% of the cases involved premature or unnatural deaths, and the majority of the premature or unnatural death past lives were men, which aligns with the society average of men making up the majority of premature deaths. It's also worth noting that this phenomena seems almost exclusive to children between the age of 2 to 5, with the phenomena and the ability to recall the past life fading before the age of 6. Also noted, which I found quite interesting, is that the average time between the death of the previous life and the claimed reincarnation is 4.5 years. Again, we have to remember that these unbelievable reports are extensively analysed over 200 individual data points to assess their credibility. This is not the same thing as people believing wild claims because it supports a spiritual position. This is over half a century's worth of work by credible scientists trying their best to put this phenomena through the scientific method. They have considered and controlled for parents looking to gain attention and feeding the child stories. They control for accidental influence. They are trained psychological professionals aware of children's capacity for make-believe. These things are thoroughly assessed at a very high level. And despite all of this work over 2,500 cases, their scientific conclusion is as follows. Currently, the best explanation for the strongest cases appears to be that memories, emotions, and even physical traumas can, at the least under certain circumstances, carry over from one life to a subsequent one. This is not to say that such carryover is universal or even common, since children with apparent memories of previous lives may well be the exception rather than the rule in many ways. These cases also do not necessarily confirm religious doctrines such as karma, and the carryover may be a better description of the process than reincarnation, a term that those doctrines associated with it. Regardless of the term used, the cases contribute to the evidence for survival of consciousness after death. It's worth remembering that scientists have to be completely emotionally uninvolved with their work to avoid falling victim to cognitive biases that could influence them and corrupt their work. So a good scientist would not say with 100% conviction that they believe X phenomena is caused by Y. Fortunately, we have the luxury of being able to hold opinions about the topic and the data without our professional credibility being at stake for doing so. Myself, after reviewing a lot of this data and a number of the more convincing case studies, I am willing to believe that this phenomena is somehow real. The evidence is simply overwhelmingly in its favour. I'd be very interested in conversing with you about your opinions now you are also aware how much data is out there in support of this phenomena. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and I'll be making a few more videos on this topic, bringing the best case studies to light. If you want to support this channel, a like and subscribe would be greatly appreciated, and hopefully I can read your opinion on this topic in the comments. Thank you.